No hour is wasted when spent in the saddle. Winston Churchill. If dogs are man's best friend, then the horse is his second best friend. The bond between humans and horses spans the human experience, from the soldier and his horse on the battlefield fighting and dying together in the chaos of war, to the 12-year-old girl riding a pony at the county fair. The origins of the horse are far older than that of the knights of Europe or even the chariot racers of much of the ancient world. 50 million years ago, in what is now North America, a group of creatures roughly the size of a raccoon would be the first proto-horses. Not across the endless plains, but rather in the primeval forests. These were rather unimpressively sized proto-horses, with their hoofed feet, an odd number of toes on each foot, and by and large are considered to be less related to other farm animals like pigs and cattle than they are to, well, rhinos, the closest nature has ever gotten to the battering ram. As the climate became more arid, the forests retreated, as the grasses conquered the landscape, with the ability to digest cellulose, and their legs capable of galloping across the open plains. Horses would evolve from a weasel-sized creature into large beasts. To this day, the evolution of the horse is one of the most widely studied, in part due to their very well intact fossil remains, and numerous ancestral spirits that they left behind in the process. Did I mean spirits? I meant species, but you get the gist. However, horses in their North American motherland would eventually go extinct, not to return for thousands upon thousands of years. It is unclear if this regional extinction was over 10,000 years ago, and it was the result of climate change or the arrival of humans, which had by this point wiped out much of the non-African megafauna wherever they went. If it was due to humans, these ancestral enemies on one side of the earth would become very close friends on the other side. Thankfully, numerous horses had already crossed into other continents through the land bridge, and did best along the Eurasian steppe of Central Asia and Eastern Europe. It is these horses and their relatively new homeland that would end up interacting with a bipedal ape from Africa, and together would form a bond that would shape history for millennia. Now, you might be wondering why, for example, an iconic animal similar to the horse and donkey like a zebra native to the plains of Africa, just as humans are, never became domesticated. Well, zebras, unlike horses, are, well, assholes. They bite and kick, and they can't really be domesticated. One theory as to why African animals like zebras, along with, say, African elephants, have never been domesticated is because they co-evolved with human hunters in Africa, and as a result became far more aggressive and fearful. On the other hand, animals that are not from Africa tend to be less afraid of humans. We can see this, for example, comparing Asian elephants with African elephants. I've been to the Serengeti in Africa, as well as the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, and the temperament between a group of animals that has interacted with humans for a very long time and ones that have been very isolated from humans is like night and day. This may partially explain why sub-Saharan Africa did not develop as complexly as Eurasia did, as its animal husbandry was not quite as advanced. Humans, however, would eventually spread into the Asian steppe. By the time they had interacted with horses on a large scale, they had already domesticated the dog from the gray wolf, as well as other livestock used for food. Early on, horses were hunted, and this is oftentimes depicted in cave art. However, these crafty African apes thought of something better suited for their skills: transportation. Horses, however, proved to be very difficult due to their speed and aggression, but nonetheless, humans brought these beasts to heel around 3500 BC in an area stretching from what is now Ukraine to the lower steppes of Russia through Kazakhstan. It was not simply a matter of making horses tamer. Horses were also bred to be bigger, at least for the most part. Ponies, however, were bred to be smaller. Through the use of artificial selection, they developed a stronger back, which would eventually become capable of pulling carts and chariots, and eventually allowing humans to sit on them directly. The remains of horses were oftentimes found in human graves, and were oftentimes depicted in human art as symbols of speed and strength. showing that these early human cultures revered them above most other animals, like, say, pigs or chickens. The people in the grasslands of what are now Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan at the time were known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Through their base language, the invention of the wheel, cart, and the domestication of the horse, all of which are products of the flat terrain of which they lived upon, they would use this triumvirate to spread across much of Europe and what is now part of Iran and the Indian subcontinent. Their ability to move quickly, thanks to the horse and wheeled carts, meant that they managed to take over nearly all of Europe. They would spread their religion, which would morph into the mythologies of ancient Greece and the Germanic Vikings eventually. To this day, the only pre-Indo-European language that is still spoken in Europe is the Basque language in Spain, along with some newcomers that came in after the Indo-European invasions. English, the language that I'm speaking now, is an Indo-European language, and had it not been for the horse, which allowed these Indo-European people to spread so fast, I probably would not be speaking English. I'd be speaking a different language, and for that matter, I might not even exist. So I guess you can thank horses for that. The Indo-Europeans also spread southwards to what is now Iran, nurturing the foundation of Persian civilization, and they would also move into the Indian subcontinent, conquering the Indus River Valley civilization, or at the very least, taking up what was left when it collapsed. This would eventually create the standard version of Hindi over the course of time, as well as a religion of Hinduism, and more depressingly, the caste system. Later on, a guy with a tiny mustache would be fascinated by this story and claim that it was the Aryans that had superior blood that led to them conquering much of this land, but this is, well, horse shit. It was not due to any apparent genetic superiority of the Indo-Europeans or Aryan peoples, but rather due to artificial selection induced by the horses. So I guess you could argue that the horses were genetically superior. Without the horse, the face of Russia, Western Europe, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent would not be what it is today. Overall, the separation of uses as well as the geographic divergence led to various people groups to breed horses in different ways. Some were better suited for pushing carts, others for plowing the fields, others for warfare, and others to a lesser extent for meat and companionship. Eventually, the horse was used in warfare to produce the chariot, with a cart behind the horse, and a man on top of the chariot with spears or bows. At the time, saddle technology was not as advanced enough to allow horseback riders, and horses still weren't large enough. Weapons at the time were made from bronze, and not quite apt for horseback riding. However, iron weapons would come onto the scene. Horse chariots would become an icon of the first great pitched battle in recorded history, the Battle of Kadesh, between the Egyptians and the Indo-European Hittites. We still really don't know who won, and chances are it was probably a stalemate, but both of them came back with tales of glorious victories. However, these tales of victory are most likely horse shit. Horse-drawn chariots would eventually find their way into the myths and folklore as well. For example, the Greeks told the story of the Trojan War, when Achilles, after killing Hector, dragged his corpse tied to a chariot. To this day, there is still some debate as to whether or not horses were used for driving chariots in Greece at this time. Eventually, you would see buggies and some limited horseback riding on a small scale. But given the technological and biological limitations of small Bronze Age horses early on, along with the shady military historical records, riding horses with a chariot was probably far more important during the early days of civilization, but was later replaced with horseback riding. During the Iron Age, this changed. As horses became larger, saddle technology improved, and animal husbandry became more advanced. By the Classical Age, horseback riding was widely adopted. One of the most famous was Alexander the Great's horse, which I'm not going to even bother pronouncing the name of. He was not the first or the last major historical figure to bond with his horse. Julius Caesar and Caligula both bonded with their horses. In fact, Caligula even placed his horse on the Roman Council. Horses played a role in the myth of the Pegasus, while in various other cultures they inspired tales of the unicorn. Now back to reality. Plenty of other cultures would adopt the horse for military purposes. They became the mainstay of Chinese military theory, and to a lesser extent in India due to the rivalry with elephant cavalry. In the Arabian Peninsula, the combination of The horse and camel cavalry led the Arabs to help crush the Greeks, Persians, and Berbers, along with Indians and Western European forces alike, spreading Islam rapidly. However, the most formidable people to master the saddle actually trace their origin back to the same place where the modern horses do, the Eurasian steppes. The absence of land good enough for large-scale farming, let alone cities, led most people here to be nomadic. Horses were not merely a form of transportation or food in Central Asia, but rather a way of life. This is why they oftentimes are called equestrian cultures, in reference to their horses. The earliest were the Scythians, at least in recorded history, during the time of classical Greece and Persia, followed by the Huns, the scourge of Rome, and then by the Turks, who crushed Greek, Arab, and Persian alike with the help of their horses, but eventually settled down themselves. The most famous or infamous of these equestrian cultures were of course the Mongols. The Mongols were born and raised on the steppes of the Central Asian mass, where soil is too poor to farm, there's barely any rain, and temperatures range from -40°C to +40°C. This essentially creates some of the toughest people on the planet. And they could not eat grass. As humans, they can't digest cellulose, but their goats, sheep, camels, and most of all horses could. And with those horses, they were able to conquer vast territorial empires, which in world history would become the largest terrestrial empire on the planet, stretching from Russia to China, Baghdad to Southeast Asia, sacking cities and crushing empires under the hooves of their horses. When it came to maritime invasions, however, that didn't involve horses, their attempts were less successful, most notably in Japan. However, after Genghis Khan died, the empire broke apart due to various horse-lord factions taking control. One of the most infamous is Timur, who created a mountain of skulls using his horse cavalry and horse-based armies. These nomadic peoples, for the most part, with some exceptions, did not settle to form large cities or very complex civilizations. They were instead rather fond of destroying them. However, with the rise of gunpowder, artillery, and other weapons, early modern fortifications ended up leading many of these nomadic peoples to quickly see their military prowess be overshadowed by those of more civilized people, if you could call them that. Eventually, many of these steppe cultures were conquered by Chinese, Russian, and Persian empires, all of which threw off their yokes as civilization came back with a vengeance. And the last outpost of equestrian culture went from being the conquerors to the conquered. Today, Mongolia itself is a sparsely populated nation with a tiny economy. However, horses were still used in the military, even though they were no longer the decisive factor. Eventually, the Spaniards would sail across the Atlantic and bring the horses back to their homeland. They would use the horses to crush the Aztec and Incan empires, who had never seen horses before, thinking that they were beasts attached to white men. When the Spanish fought the Incas, the Incan soldiers ran away in the face of a cavalry charge, not knowing that the way to fight horses is actually to stand your ground, and as a result, the Incans were mowed down and their empire collapsed. Eventually, the Spanish would move further north into North America and eventually what is now the United States. And some of those horses eventually escaped and were abandoned and became feral mustangs, which roamed across the Great Plains and deserts of the United States and still do so to this day. While the complex civilizations of Central and South America feared the horse, the hunter-gatherer societies of North America managed to domesticate them on some level. The iconic image of the Native American riding across the plains on his horse, hunting the bison, came after Europeans arrived. With the horse, the plains native peoples like the Apache, Comanche, and Lakota proved to be one of the most formidable sets of forces against incoming settler nations, the US, Canada, and Mexico. To this day, the Mustangs, while not native modern species to the US, are still protected by the US Department of Interior, which manages national parks. As, after all, these horses resemble freedom, ruggedness, and the individualism of the American spirit. Horses in the military continued to be common during the early days of industrialization, but their military purposes were limited, as European colonization of Africa was stifled due to horses dying by the tsetse flies there. With industry, the prototype of the cars were coming into fruition, along with the train. You can thank Carl Benz and Henry Ford for that. Henry Ford, the brainchild of the Ford Motor Corporation, actually hated horses. And I suppose this kind of influenced his realization that he should set up the Model T. After all, Henry Ford was quoted as saying, "If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses." Alas, he didn't ask people what they wanted, and he went on revolutionizing the transportation industry. It was clear that horses were no longer at the front of the race. Industrialization led to the removal of animals from everyday life outside of pets and urban wildlife. A car, and even more so the train, could move faster than a horse, carry more people than a horse, and they don't take shits. World War I solidified this trend as horses eventually no longer became used in cavalry. After all, they stood no chance against artillery, and by and large were mostly used to transport goods logistically behind the scenes, and were sometimes used in tougher terrain such as the deserts of Arabia during the Arab Revolt. Otherwise, horses were mostly used for sending messages and doing burdens. And in World War II, they pretty much became obsolete completely in direct battle, only used for limited logistics and scouting terrain in areas that were too muddy for vehicles of that era. During the post-World War II era, cavalry still existed, but at this time, air cavalry is used to refer to helicopters. Given their speed and maneuverability, they are quite reminiscent of horses. Horse ownership, once an icon of masculinity, was soon placed by the car. No longer on the battlefield, riding horses just lost its machismo. Today, horses are not a ride of war heroes, but rather for 11-year-old girls looking for some extracurricular activities. Thankfully, horses will no longer be dying bloody deaths. Many militaries still use them, but they're oftentimes for ceremonial purposes, harkening back to the past. This is also true for police forces, most famously the Canadian Mounties. Going back to pre-modern agrarian times, with protein to be found from other animal sources, horses became less important as a source for food, and namely protein, to various cultures with some exceptions. The horse, with his power and strength, would eventually beat the yoked ox when it came to plowing the fields for agricultural productivity, thereby helping humans to produce food rather than becoming food themselves. However, eventually both the ox and the horse would be surpassed by the tractor due to, yes, industrialization. And just like that, it eventually was surpassed by the car. To this day, horse meat is taboo in various cultures, is haram in Islam, forbidden by Jewish law, and is widely considered unethical in the English-speaking world. It's also considered to be a taboo in countries like Argentina and Uruguay, as their ranching cultures have instilled the notion of horses as friends, not food. However, horse meat is still somewhat popular at the very least, if not taboo, in some French-speaking parts of the world. Others argue that the human-horse bond should prohibit people from eating meat from horses. Part of East Asia also eat horses, particularly in Central Asia, like the Stan countries and Mongolia, which is rather surprising and unsurprising at the same time, given how common the bond with horses are, but at the same time, the scarcity and lack of resources leads to desperation, which may result in them eating horses. For the most part, horses today are relegated to less pressing matters in work, warfare, and food. Throughout much of their history, they were used for sports and tournaments, like jousting, polo, and others. Due to how expensive owning a horse was and still is, this is technically relegated to the rich. Poor people play sports on their feet, and today those sports have outcompeted any sport on a horse. It isn't much of a sport if you don't get your ass sweaty. Due to their high costs and high maintenance, horses could also not compete as a major pet. After all, many people had moved to the cities and suburbs. With competition from easier to manage pets like dogs, cats, hamsters, piranhas, and bearded dragons, less and less people owned horses for pleasure. Yeah, so they aren't the central players in sports or the pet world anymore either. Well, there's horse racing, and that's sort of a sport, but people just by and large watch that for gambling, I guess. Since the early 20th century, the population of horses has been declining. An animal that plays a fairly minor impact on our modern day had played such a profound role in the lives of people as recently as less than 100 years ago. This has been a profound change given how much of an impact they had throughout much of written history. Perhaps it's best for the horse. After thousands of years of hard work and bloody battles, it's time to let these veterans retire on the old farm. Perhaps their story will be the story of cows, chickens, and pigs, who may also be replaced with technology. when we get more synthetic meat. The same way that the car and train replaced the horses. Sure, our generals don't charge into battle on them anymore, but looking back at how our two species have been so interconnected, all I can say is that it's been one hell of a ride. Yes, terrible pun intended. And with that terrible pun, the story ends.